For as long as Luke could remember, he had been drawn to the unknown, a relentless pull toward the supernatural that had consumed him since childhood. What had started as innocent curiosity, sneaking into old, creaking houses in his neighborhood, devouring ghost stories under the covers with a flashlight, had spiraled into something far more intense. With each passing year, his obsession grew, transforming into a passion that demanded answers. As he grew older, that curiosity turned into an unwavering dedication to unraveling the mysteries that others shied away from. Now, as an investigative journalist specializing in the supernatural, Luke had spent years chasing shadows, confronting forgotten histories, and documenting some of the most haunted, terrifying places on Earth. And with every case, every encounter, the feeling grew stronger, that there was something out there, something more to the world than what met the eye. But none of those experiences came close to the ominous reputation that loomed over Waverly Hills Sanatorium. It was as if the very walls of the place had soaked up the despair, misery, and death that had once been so abundant there. Waverly Hills was no ordinary haunted site. It stood like a silent sentinel over Louisville, Kentucky, its crumbling facade and broken windows a testament to the horrors that had taken place within. Over a century ago, when tuberculosis was a death sentence, Waverly Hills had been a place of hopelessness. Thousands of patients, men, women, and children, had taken their last, agonizing breaths within its walls, succumbing to the disease in the days before antibiotics brought relief. The sheer number of deaths was staggering, and the staff had created a tunnel, cold and stark, that led underground, known ominously as the Death Tunnel. This grim passage was designed to discreetly transport the bodies, shielding the living patients from the constant reminder of their own fate. The building had become a graveyard, not just for the bodies that were removed through that tunnel, but for the souls that seemed to linger. Decades later, after the sanatorium had closed its doors, stories of restless spirits wandering the halls continued to surface. It had become a notorious destination for paranormal enthusiasts, but even those who didn't believe in ghosts could feel the weight of the building's dark history. To stand before Waverly Hills was to feel the weight of death itself pressing down on you. And it was this place, this decaying, haunted monument of pain, that Luke had set his sights on. Luke's team had been with him for years, through countless investigations. Sarah, the team's tech expert, always had a gadget for every situation, a firm believer that technology could capture what the human eye couldn't see. Joe, the historian, had spent days meticulously researching the sanatorium, poring over records of every death, every mysterious event, every unexplainable occurrence. Michael, a former soldier, was their anchor, practical, level-headed, someone who kept them grounded when the atmosphere grew too thick with fear. Together, they had become more than just colleagues. They were a tight-knit group bound by a shared purpose. But as they approached Waverly Hills that night, even Michael's usual calm exterior seemed to waver. The night was unnaturally quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The moon, veiled by thick clouds, cast only a faint, eerie glow over the towering structure. Their footsteps crunched against the overgrown gravel path, each step seeming to echo unnaturally in the stillness. The closer they got, the more suffocating the atmosphere became, like an unseen force pressing down on them, urging them to turn back. But they pressed on, the anticipation mixed with dread gnawing at them. Sarah broke the silence first, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "This place feels wrong," she murmured, her usual confidence faltering. Luke glanced at her, and for a moment he saw the fear in her eyes, fear that mirrored his own. Sarah was never easily shaken, but tonight there was something different, something darker in the air. "It's just the nerves," Luke said, more to reassure himself than anyone else. "We've faced worse than this, right?" His voice, though steady, carried an undercurrent of doubt. The heavy, rusted doors creaked open with a groan, and the cold that rushed out to meet them was unlike anything they had ever felt before. It wasn't just the chill of an abandoned building. It was as if the air itself carried the echoes of the past, of suffering and death. As they stepped inside, the temperature dropped noticeably, even though it was midsummer. Their flashlights flickered, casting long, ominous shadows that seemed to dance and move in the periphery of their vision. The smell hit them next, an overwhelming stench of rot, mold, and something far more unsettling, like the lingering odor of decay that had seeped into the very foundation of the building. Every breath they took seemed tainted by the air of the sanatorium. Every step felt as if it reverberated through the empty halls, bouncing back at them as if the building itself was aware of their presence. "Let's split up," Luke said, his voice filled with authority, though his heart raced with anxiety. His mind knew the logic: cover more ground, document more evidence, but his gut screamed at him to stay together, to remain in the safety of numbers. But he couldn't show fear. Not here, not now. The team hesitated. No one wanted to be the first to speak against the plan. They were professionals, after all, and splitting up had always been their method. But here, in this place, it felt wrong. Luke could sense their reluctance, but he pushed forward, hiding his growing unease. Luke and Sarah ventured into the West Wing, the infamous death tunnel beckoning them like a dark abyss. As they descended, the air grew thick, almost suffocating, clinging to their skin like the weight of forgotten souls. Every step they took reverberated through the narrow walls, their flashlights struggling against the oppressive darkness, casting faint, trembling beams that seemed to be swallowed by the tunnel's depth. Sarah's voice trembled as she whispered, "It's too quiet. I don't like it down here." Luke didn't need to say a word. His silence was agreement enough. The tunnel stretched endlessly before them, like the maw of some ancient creature, growing narrower, more confining, as if the very walls sought to squeeze the life from them. Then, a sound. Barely there at first, just a distant murmur. But it grew, became sharper, unmistakable. A whisper, like breath drawn from beyond the grave, floated through the air, a haunting call from the shadows. "Did you hear that?" Sarah's words were barely a whisper themselves, her fear palpable. Luke nodded, gripping his flashlight tighter, trying to steady his breathing. "Yeah, it's probably just the wind," he muttered, though deep inside, he knew the lie fell flat. No wind could find its way this deep underground. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, as though the very walls of the tunnel were alive with voices. "Help me." The words seemed to come from every direction at once, a ghostly cacophony that rattled through their bones. Sarah's flashlight flickered, casting shadows that twisted and danced on the walls, mocking them, moving as if they had a life of their own. "Luke, we should leave." Sarah's voice was taut with fear, her breath shallow. "Something's wrong. I can feel it." Luke's skin prickled. A chill ran down his spine, colder than the tunnel itself. "Let's head back. This place is a maze. We can't afford to get lost." But as they turned to leave, a movement, just a flicker at the edge of Luke's vision, stopped him in his tracks. His heart hammered in his chest as he shone his light into the void. Nothing, just darkness. But the sensation of being watched, of unseen eyes lurking in the shadows, was overwhelming. As they emerged from the tunnel, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere seemed to ease slightly, but the tension lingered like an invisible weight on their shoulders. When they reached the main hall, Joe and Michael were already waiting, their faces pale, their expressions unsettled. "I saw something," Joe murmured, his voice barely audible, as if speaking louder would summon whatever he had encountered. "A figure, down the hall. But when I got close, it just vanished." Michael, usually the unflinching one, nodded grimly. "Same here. Footsteps. But when I turned around, no one was there." Luke swallowed the rising unease, trying to keep everyone calm. "We knew this place was active. Let's not jump to conclusions. We'll set up the cameras and see what we can capture." Their next destination was room 502, infamous for the tragedy that had unfolded there decades ago. The moment they stepped inside, the temperature dropped. Their breath fogged in the freezing air, though it was the middle of summer. The room felt like a tomb. Luke placed the EMF reader down, and instantly it spiked into the red, the device shrieking in alarm. Sarah hugged herself, shivering uncontrollably. "It's freezing in here." Joe's voice was shaky. This is the room where the nurse hanged herself, right?" Luke nodded slowly. "That's what they say." She was pregnant, unmarried, and in despair. They say she never left. Without warning, the door to room 502 slammed shut with a deafening crash, the force rattling the very walls. Sarah screamed, and Joe rushed to the door, tugging at the handle. It wouldn't budge. They were trapped. "We're not alone," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with terror. She pointed shakily to the far corner of the room. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure. Barely visible at first, but as the darkness shifted, the outline of a woman became clearer. A nurse, her uniform tattered and ghostly. Her face was a mask of sorrow, pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow voids of despair. "Get out!" a voice boomed, but none of them had spoken. The words echoed in their minds, a command filled with malice. Luke's heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts racing as the EMF reader screamed in his hand. This wasn't a trick of the light. This was real. The figure began to move, her form flickering like static, a distorted, nightmarish vision. In a sudden, violent motion, the ghost lunged at Sarah. Her icy fingers grazed Sarah's arm, and she let out a blood-curdling scream as a wave of freezing cold surged through her body. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed, trembling uncontrollably. Luke fumbled desperately with the door, his hands slick with sweat. Finally, with a forceful yank, the door flew open, and they bolted from the room, terror driving them forward. The building seemed to come alive around them, doors slamming in the distance, whispers echoing down the halls, shadows darting just out of sight. It was as if the entire sanatorium had awakened, angry at their intrusion, determined to drive them out. When they finally burst through the front doors, the cold night air hit them like a shockwave, but it did little to ease the suffocating terror that clung to them. They collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, hearts still hammering in their chests, their bodies trembling with adrenaline. The cameras, forgotten for a moment, were still rolling, capturing every breathless second, every trembling hand, every look of sheer, unfiltered fear. "We got it!" Luke panted, his voice rough, chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. "We finally got real evidence." But even as the words left his lips, Sarah's wide, haunted eyes remained fixed on the looming silhouette of Waverly Hills behind them. The building seemed to breathe in the darkness, its hulking form pressing down on them, a monstrous shadow that refused to let go. Her skin still tingled with the memory of the ghost's icy touch, a cold that seemed to sink deeper into her bones with every passing second. "What if?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, her words trembling in the air. "What if it follows us?" Before Luke could respond, the night itself seemed to shudder. The air grew thick, suffocating, and then it came. That voice, the same voice that had echoed through the deathly silence of the tunnel, now crawling out of the darkness, seeping into their bones. "You can't leave." The voice was everywhere and nowhere, a chilling, disembodied whisper that wrapped around them like invisible hands, tightening, suffocating. The team froze, the air around them thick with dread. It wasn't over. Whatever was inside Waverly Hills, it wasn't done with them yet. Luke's pulse quickened. The voice, low, chilling, undeniable, had followed them outside. He stared at the others, their faces pale, drenched in sweat despite the cold. The cameras kept rolling, but the evidence no longer mattered. What they had encountered wasn't just a ghostly presence, it was something far more sinister, something that refused to let them go. "We have to leave now," Michael urged, his voice steady but laced with fear. His military training was kicking in, and it told him that staying in the open was dangerous. But leaving didn't seem so simple anymore. Not with the shadow of Waverly Hills looming behind them, and the entity that had made itself known. Luke turned to Sarah. She was shaking, still staring at the building, as though expecting the ghostly figure to emerge from the darkness, to cross the threshold and step into their world. "Sarah," Luke said, trying to bring her back. "We need to go now." She tore her gaze away from the sanatorium, her voice fragile. "It touched me, Luke. I can still feel it. What if it's inside me?" A cold realization washed over Luke. Could something have attached itself to them? He had heard stories of malevolent spirits latching onto the living, following them, tormenting them. He had never believed it until now. The team stumbled towards their van, every shadow, every whisper of the wind, sending waves of terror through them. They slammed the doors shut, and Michael started the engine. But as the vehicle roared to life, something unnatural happened. The headlights flickered, casting eerie, dancing shapes across the road ahead. The radio crackled, and through the static, that same voice whispered again, this time closer, almost inside the van. "You can't leave." Michael's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Just drive!" Luke shouted, panic seeping into his voice. The tires screeched as they sped down the abandoned road, the imposing silhouette of Waverly Hills shrinking in the rearview mirror. But the sense of dread didn't fade. The further they got from the sanatorium, the more it felt like something was pulling them back. Sarah began to shake uncontrollably. "It's not over. I can feel it. It's still with us." Luke's heart sank. He turned to her, fear reflecting in her eyes. "We'll figure it out. We'll get help," he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed his own words. There was no guidebook for what they were dealing with, no way to understand what had latched onto them. As they drove into the night, the van's windows began to fog, though the air outside was clear. A thin, spectral handprint appeared on the glass, slowly, methodically, dragging downwards. Luke's breath caught in his throat. Then, suddenly, the engine sputtered. The van slowed, grinding to a halt on the empty road. "No, no, no," Michael muttered, turning the key again and again, but the engine was dead. The lights dimmed until they were left in complete darkness. And then came the final blow, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Soft, deliberate, getting louder, closer. Luke's heart thundered in his chest as the air around them grew impossibly cold. The darkness outside seemed to ripple, and then, out of the shadows, the ghostly figure of the nurse appeared. Pale, hollow-eyed, her gaunt face expressionless, but filled with malice. Sarah screamed as the figure moved toward the van, her ghostly form phasing through the metal like it wasn't there. The inside temperature plummeted, their breaths visible in the icy air. The nurse's lips curled into a grotesque smile as she whispered, "You can't leave." Suddenly, the window shattered, glass exploding inward as the figure lunged for Sarah. Luke reached out to pull her back, but his hands passed right through the ghost's cold, transparent form. Sarah let out a choked gasp, her eyes rolling back as the ghost's presence overwhelmed her. "Sarah, no!" Luke shouted, helpless as the nurse's grip seemed to tighten around her very soul. Sarah's body convulsed, her voice a strangled scream as the entity drained her, leaving her limp and gasping for breath. Michael and Joe tried to help, but the air around them grew heavier, pressing them down, making it impossible to move. Luke's mind raced. How could they fight something that wasn't even alive? But then he remembered something. In his years of investigating, he had read about spirits being tied to objects, to places. What if the nurse was bound to Waverly Hills? What if they could break the connection? "Sarah!" Luke shouted. "We have to go back." Her eyes fluttered open, barely conscious, but there was a flicker of understanding. "Back," she whispered weakly. "She's tied to that place. If we go back, maybe we can break her hold." Without another word, Michael restarted the engine. This time it roared to life. The van lurched forward, and they sped back toward the sanatorium, the ghostly figure of the nurse still hovering around them, relentless in her pursuit. As they neared the crumbling facade of Waverly Hills, the ghost began to fade, her form flickering like a weak signal. Luke watched as she screamed, her face contorted in rage, but the closer they got to the building, the weaker she became. Finally, as they reached the entrance, the ghost let out one final, ear-piercing wail before dissolving into nothingness. They skidded to a halt, their bodies trembling, hearts pounding in the silence that followed. The ghost was gone, her power broken, but the fear remained. Luke looked at Sarah, her pale face illuminated by the faint glow of the van's dashboard. "It's over," he said, though his voice wavered. "At least, for now." The team sat in stunned silence, the weight of their experience settling in. They had survived Waverly Hills. But as they looked back at the shadowy figure of the sanatorium, still looming against the dark sky, one thing was certain: some places never let you go. And Waverly Hills was one of them. So friends, if you enjoyed this story, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more exciting tales. Your comments mean a lot to us, so let us know what you liked the most about this story and how we can improve it to make it even better for you.